Welcome everybody to today's micro lecture on non-discrimination. As you can see, this micro lecture is structured in the following way. We will start with some examples at the beginning. We will then look at the definition of non-discrimination, and we will see in which fields discrimination based on which criteria can be illegal. Here we have some guiding questions which should make you reflect already by now, so that you try to answer those questions. And as you know, those questions will then be answered by the end of this micro lecture. So it's about the definition of non-discrimination, the criteria, the question where those rules apply, and in which fields we often can observe discrimination. On top of the building of the US Supreme Court, we find the slogan of equal justice under law. In the EU, justice is a value. Non-discrimination is a principle which is very important to lead to justice. And of course, ideally, equal justice under law, the situation that we have in law would be perceived to be just or fair. If we look at this picture, the question is this necessarily a situation of discrimination? So on the left-hand side, that's not necessarily discrimination, because if those guys brought the boxes themselves, then no one has been discriminated. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, if one person is actively supported, that can be referred to as positive discrimination or as affirmative action. So here we have some examples, and you could try to answer those questions if you would qualify that as discrimination. So first question, should women earn as much as men for the same work? Next example, women and men going to the hairdresser, should they pay the same price? Very often, next question, we have situation that locals and tourists would pay different prices if they go skiing, if they go to a swimming pool, or as you can see at the end of this slide, if they visit a facility as Disneyland Paris. Often we also have to discuss the question if when accessing some very sensitive health or medical services, the question if homosexuals should be treated in the same way as heterosexuals. So we have that very often in the discussion when it comes to assisted reproductive technologies. And another question, should young people earn as much as older people in the field of employment? So what's the definition of discrimination? As you hopefully have seen from the previous examples, if we have two situations which are deemed to be comparable, but if we treat them in a different way, or if we have two different situations but treat them in the same way, then that's qualified as discrimination. So you have the definition from this case of the Court of Justice, and below the question of when could we deem two situations to be comparable. But if we put it together into one mathematical formula, if you like, if the situation of A equals the situation of B, then you should treat them in the same way. If their situation is different, then you should also not treat them in the same way. Again, affirmative action or positive discrimination, that's not precisely the same topic, because here someone is disadvantaged and we actively try to support that person so that in the end they have an equal situation. As you might know, there are two different ways how you can be affected from EU law, most of the time how you can benefit from EU law. One possibility is to rely on the EU's fundamental freedoms, so those economic market rights, so the right that you can trade your products, that you can work in another country, that you can provide or receive services, amongst others. The other possibility is that you can rely on certain EU directives or EU regulations, for instance, air passenger rights, roaming regulation, e-commerce directive, and so on. Now, what are the criteria for those two fields according to which you should not be discriminated. Let's start with the first field. So in the context of those economic market rights, the fundamental freedoms, you have the right, for instance, not to be discriminated when receiving a service based on your nationality or your passport. So that was the example when you go skiing and so on. Of course, sometimes you would not be asked for your passport, but for your residence or a residence certificate. That would not be qualified as an open discrimination, but as a disguised discrimination, and, that's very important, both are equally illegal. If we turn to the second way how you can be affected by EU law, there are certain EU directives and EU regulations, and as you can see, there are different criteria on which you should not be discriminated. So not nationality or your passport, but other criteria like gender, ethnic background, religion or belief, disability, age or sexual orientation. So those are different criteria. Now, where does that apply? Very briefly, of course, that applies in the 28 EU member states, but sometimes those rights also apply outside the EU, especially in the European Economic Area, also involving Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. Now if we turn to this second way how you can be affected by EU law, as you can see on this matrix, there are different criteria that apply in different fields. So for instance, discrimination based on religion, disability and so on in the employment field is illegal, and you can find further information in these EU directives. So the numbers indicated here, they refer to these EU directives which provide for more information in that regard. As you can also see, there is a green box, and here we have a proposal of the European Commission from 2008, which needs to be adopted by the European Parliament and by the Council of Ministers. So here we have the answers to these examples at the beginning. So you can see the different criteria based on which a person can argue to be discriminated, and we have the different fields where that discrimination has occurred. So now you know about the definition of discrimination. So two situations that we deem to be comparable, but they are treated in the same way, or different situations treated in the same way. Just very briefly to mention that sometimes there are good reasons why such a discrimination can be justified. So that's what we call reasons of justification. And it's very important to know that there are different criteria. So nationality or your passport in the field of the fundamental freedoms. And not only does open discrimination would be illegal, also disguised forms of discrimination. So if we have a criteria like residence, which seems to be neutral, but in the end also leads to discrimination. In the other fields, so if we don't talk about the fundamental freedoms, but about harmonization of national law via EU directives and EU regulations, there we have other criteria according to which discrimination can also be illegal. Where does that apply? Mainly in the EU, but sometimes also outside the EU in the European Economic Area. In which fields can we observe discrimination? So far, mainly in the situation where member states try to favor their own citizens and try to discriminate against foreigners. But nowadays, very often we can also find discrimination in the field of digitalization, for instance, machine learning, where if we have data which is based on discriminatory situations, for instance, because it's about data from the employment field where women do not earn as much as men. So if we take this biased data, and if, for instance, if you use that for machine learning, obviously then also the outcome would be discriminatory. So we could say rubbish in, rubbish out. So that's a new field where we have to discuss the topic of non-discrimination. So Hopefully you now know more about the principle of non-discrimination, a very important principle in EU law, and see you next time.